In this video, I want to dive a little bit deeper into a topic which I raised about a week ago on LinkedIn and on the Code Guy community. And this topic is looking at the question specifically under the ESRS and under the ESRS's double materiality impact assessment. Can we consider reductions or reducing a negative impact to be a positive impact? Now, the too long didn't read answer here is no, we cannot. However, there are a number of provisos to this, and there are a number of complications, both in terms of how we read the ESRS and in terms of how this is carried out in practice, which means it's worthwhile delving a little bit deeper into this specific question. The response to this question on LinkedIn in particular was quite strong and varied, and the responses sat everywhere on the spectrum from, on one hand, that a reduction in a negative should never be considered as a positive, and there weren't any scenarios under which that could be conceived as such. And on the other hand, down to the suggestion that reducing a negative under certain circumstances, in fact, should be seen as a positive. There were also some suggestions, perhaps dismissive or derisive, that the whole enterprise of trying to answer this question was somewhat of a waste of time. However, I think there is value in answering this question, and this is not from a theoretical perspective. This is from a practice perspective, because when you actually start looking at the impacts that companies have and trying to codify them, very often we run into problems, and these are often language problems, but describing those impacts and accurately categorizing so that they can be understandable will actually have to happen in practice. The ESRS tells us to do this. So we should try to find the most efficient, universal, and consistent way of doing this. And I think laughing off efforts or dismissing efforts to try and get to the bottom of this is something that we shouldn't encourage. A quick recap then of what we talked about in the social media post. I proposed at the time when I first drafted this that there were three options for how people were attacking, answering, solving this question. I was corrected that these aren't really options. Some of these could be considered to be procedurally or methodologically incorrect, and others apparently have been rejected in practice, leaving us with only one of these three methods, and that is the third one as the one that most people seem to agree with. However, I would still propose that there is an argument to be made for the second methodology here under certain circumstances. So just to recap then, these methodologies were that both a positive and a negative, if the negative was being reduced by a positive, could be listed as separate impacts and assessed separately. That, I think, has been almost universally disregarded as procedurally incorrect. The second method is where you would only include the reduction of a negative as a positive when you are not reducing the negative that you are somehow responsible for. So reducing a negative that you contribute towards is not a positive, but reducing a negative that you are not contributing towards could be seen as a positive. The third option here being that you should ignore the reduction of negatives entirely as standalone impacts and only treat them as actions. I think we can make the argument that approach 2 and approach 3 are both sound. Now we're going to get into the real solution, I think, to this problem. And this is provided in the TEG, the Technical Expert Group meeting from the 18th of June. So this is now only a couple of months old. And this is starting to get directly to the heart of the matter. What defines a positive impact? If we go down in here, we can see some very helpful statements from EFRAG. In particular, it is helpful, and this is a reference to the Positive Impact Manifesto of the UN Finance Initiative, the UNEP initiative. It being that, is helpful in that it states that positive impacts shall only be considered once any potential negative impact to any of the ESG pillars have been duly identified and mitigated, after again falling short of clarifying what a negative impact is. Now, here we have part of the solution. that the positive impact should only be identified and described once the appropriate negatives themselves have been identified and mitigated. So if you have a negative impact on biodiversity, and if you have a positive impact on biodiversity, if they are dealing with the same impact, then the positive must be considered mitigation of the negative. It is not an individual standalone impact until the negatives have been duly identified and mitigated. EFRAG goes a little bit further now in response to this question with something that's a little bit more practically applicable. And this is where they study a specific example. So the question is, for example, is polluting less than last year, emitting less CO2 than last year, or having fewer accidents than last year defined as a positive impact or as decreasing a negative impact? And here is our answer. Positive impacts related to a material matter, that's worth noting, shall be considered only once any potential negative impact related to that matter have been duly identified and mitigated. Let's break that down. If a matter is material, we're not saying if an impact is material, we're saying if a matter is material. And remember, the matter could be material for financial or impact reasons. And it could be material already on the basis of a negative impact. If the matter is material, any positive impact related to the matter shall be considered only once any potential negative related to the matter has been identified and mitigated. If the sustainability matter itself is material, then we are in the situation where the positive impacts cannot be considered standalone. There is the phrase that we need. Now, it is slightly unfortunate that the examples given here are all comparisons to the previous year. Polluting less than last year, emitting less than last year, having fewer accidents than last year. These should not be considered positive impacts, and I agree with that. That's fairly straightforward. If you report an impact as negative, the following year you do something about it, that is actions in response to a negative. It's a shame that the specific question didn't include an impact which was newly identified. However, we can still come up with, I think, a rule that covers for those, and that is found in this sentence here. If the matter is material, then positive impacts should only be considered once the negatives have been duly identified and mitigated. That is, the negatives have been reduced to the point in their own right where they're basically non-material anymore, and now you have material possibilities for positive impacts. This doesn't quite get us to deciding which of our methodology options still are usable. I think we can quite firmly rule out methodology number 1. However, I think this still leaves the door open for methodologies 2 and 3, and I would propose that a sound approach to double materiality can still make use of methodologies 2 and 3, which I will explain in the rest of the video. We're going to get perhaps slightly more technical here, and this on the screen is application requirement 16 of ESRS 1, and this points out all of the sustainability matters, aka the topics, the subtopics, and the sub-subtopics which apply to each of the topical standards. Now, impacts, risks, and opportunities should be connected with one of these matters, unless they are an entity-specific IRO, but we'll ignore that for the purposes of this video. And when we look at the specific matters, the specific topics, subtopics, etc., there are a number of them which are already framed in rather a negative light. And this is important because this starts posing some language problems in how we formulate or how we describe negative and positive impacts. So here is a specific example: the direct impact drivers of biodiversity loss. Now, this is explicitly framed as the negative already. This is the drivers of a loss. And a loss of one of these environmental assets, biodiversity, should be considered already to be negative. And that means all of these subtopics relating to that matter are already framed in the negative. If it was true then that a positive impact cannot be considered in the light of any negative impact, that would mean that it would be impossible to have a positive impact on this subtopic and its sub-subtopic. So this matter here, because it's already framed as a negative or as negative impacts, if we establish a very inflexible rule, that makes it impossible to have positive impacts here. That seems counterintuitive, that seems absurd, because if you had a business model or a business activity that was explicitly designed to remediate or to mitigate or to restore or to eliminate the impact drivers of biodiversity loss in some way, if there was a business model that could be established around that, then you would not be able to claim that that is a positive impact. So I think we have to be a little bit more flexible, and this is where the second approach can solve this problem. Because if I am explicitly engaged in an economic activity which is designed to fix or avoid or eliminate, that is to mitigate, one of these already negatively phrased things, then I should be able to claim that as a positive if I am not responsible for the negative. And I think that's what the ESRS is trying to get us to understand. If I am in some way responsible for the negative, then any effort to reduce the negative is not a positive. It is a mitigation of an impact which I am some way responsible for. Now, whether that's occurring in my business or in the value chain I depend on, I'm still responsible. But we can have cases where a business model is explicitly designed to eliminate, mitigate, restore, whatever, where the impact was not caused by that business model and its value chain in the first place. I can make this a little more concrete. Let's say you developed a specific product or a service that you offered on the market that was designed to explicitly deal with invasive alien species. And those alien species were not alien species which you had been involved in the introduction or the spread of in any way. That seems to me to be a case where you could quite comfortably and in a way that seems methodologically sound claim as a positive impact, even though what you are doing is designed to mitigate a negative, but the negative is not something you're responsible for. So I've taken the liberty of actually trying to draft some specific positive and negative impacts that could be used under some of these specific circumstances. And I want to draw your attention to the sustainability matter, which is the direct impact driver of biodiversity loss, the example being land use change, fresh water use change, and sea use change. What I've done here is I've tried to formulate a negative impact and a positive impact for this specific sustainability matter. And you'll see in the description of how I've put these impacts together that shows you how they can be used so that the methodologies options 2 and 3 are preserved. So let's take the negative one first. So a negative impact could be the direct biodiversity loss as a result of land use change, fresh water use change, or sea use change. And this negative impact would represent the losses in biodiversity which are driven by the company's economic activities, which change land use, freshwater use, and sea use. So there is a negative impact formulation. Now I want to take a look at an example of a positive impact formulation, but I want to explicitly stress that this is not mitigating their own negative. So here we go. Here's the positive. The enablement of biodiversity gains in the wider marketplace by improving land use change, freshwater use change, and sea use change, or by improving land use, freshwater use, and sea uses. And the description reads as follows. This positive impact represents the direct gain in biodiversity, which is driven by our activities to change land use, freshwater use, and sea use. This impact is not representative of efforts to reduce negative impacts on biodiversity, which we are responsible for. So in this case, when I've identified the positive, I have explicitly ruled out any suggestion that this impact is mitigative of any negative which this organization is responsible for. So this is the way we can use the name and the description to clarify these impacts. We can have positives which mitigate somebody else's negatives. And we need to be really explicit and clear about that in the names and the descriptions of those impacts. So we now skip back to the original article, and I think we can happily rule out one now as an approach, which is allowable, sensible, methodologically correct. I think there is a strong argument that approach number 2 can be adopted. So where you are reducing negatives, where the reductions are not negatives which you were responsible, so they're not in response to your own negative impacts, that then I think is a positive. And I would make the argument that that is a positive. And we've showed some examples where, partly because of the way the sustainability matters themselves are drafted, it has to be the case that those are positives. To not allow those to be positives, to me, creates an absurdity. And I think that that is a good litmus test for a methodology. If it creates an absurd outcome, then it's probably a bad methodology. The last one here, though, in most cases, this is the approach that almost everybody will be taking. That if you're partly responsible for the negative in some way, then the reductions of negatives should not be treated as standalone positives, but they should be treated as the actions in response to that negative, or the mitigation measures in response to that negative. Let's not forget that in some cases, it might make more sense to reframe some negative impacts rather as risks, and that your responses, or the company's responses to what could be considered an negative impact, might actually be rather better framed as a risk management exercise. But I think that's probably a topic for another video, is the interaction between impacts and risks and opportunities, and how we can describe and name those.